Survival of the Fattest was the first Fat Records comp, sampler, or whatever I heard when I was discovering punk back in the mid-90s. It wasn't the original of such releases by the label. Fat Music for Fat People was released 2 years earlier. Unfortunately, I wasn't quite cool enough to be on board the punk train yet when Fat Music came out. Survival of the Fattest, however, was released just as my music collection became devoid of anything but punk. In some ways, Survival might have even been part of the reason for the mainstream music evacuation. Survival of the Fattest was like a lighthouse in a churning sea of trends, beckoning for a chance to rattle my eardrums and show me the way to what had been missing from my life until that point: an identity. Something that separated me from the crowd and led me to the shore, where a flock of like-minded individuals would greet me with open arms and high fives. I've talked about my punk obsession a ton already in other videos. If you are just tuning in for the first time, here's a quick Recus recap. Pearl Jam and Nirvana had kind of lured me away from rap and pop in the early 90s. Prior to that, I just listened to whatever was popular, and generally only the singles on the album. The rest of the songs kind of seemed unimportant, and as long as I memorized the single, I assumed I had exploited the full potential of the album to its maximum. Pearl Jam and Nirvana were different for some reason. The point in my life where the entire album seemed to hold value. I started to find an appreciation for every song, whether it was what the mainstream upvoted or not. Then Green Day happened. Kaboom! My mind was blown. It was like Nirvana, but fun. All the songs weren't just about how much life sucked, and it was more of a, even if everything sucks, let's not let it ruin our fun. Bands like Nofx, Wagon, SNFU, and Propagandhi started to wander into my music collection, and there was no turning back. Homemade mixtapes that friends made were an amazing way to discover new bands. A mixtape was kind of like the Nintendo Power magazine of the punk scene. A cheat code to find out what bands were awesome in a pre-internet world. And Survival of the Fattest was the mixtape equivalent to Up Up Down Down Left Right BA Start. Survival of the Fattest was released on March 12, 1996 on Fat Records, a label owned by Nofx frontperson Mike Burkett, or Fat Mike as we all know him by. Mike and his wife at the time, Erin, started Fat in 1990-ish, basically running it out of their 2-bedroom apartment with a closet and a fax machine at their disposal. Within 5 years, Fat grew into one of the biggest 90s punk labels around, second to Epitaph. Their plan was simple: sign cool bands, and don't spend a ton of money recording the record or on promo. Mike had said in an interview, at the peak of the label's popularity, they would only spend about 40 grand recording and promoting an album, and it would sell no less than 200,000 copies every time. Comps were a genius way to advertise the bands on the label. First off, your customers were buying your advertisement, so you got to pocket some dough that way. This was also the pre-iPod on shuffle world. Fat comps were already shuffled for you. The perfect soundtrack to parties, hangouts, and skateboarding. An impressionable teenager like myself ate that shit up. It was basically a roadmap of how to expand my CD collection in a gotta catch 'em all type situation. The first track on the Survival comp was by the biggest selling Fat band at the time, High Standard. High Standard's first record, Growing Up, sold something like 700,000 copies worldwide, with virtually no promo behind it. A version of California Dreaming was the Japanese punk rocker's contribution, a song originally recorded by Barry Maguire, but more well known for the version by the Mamas and the Papas. Track 2 was Justified Black Eye by No Use for a Name off the Leche Con Carne album. Leche Con Carne translates to milk with meat, which I'm not sure if it's an inside joke or something, but I don't really get it. No Use is kinda tied with Propagandhi as the second band to be signed to Fat. Apparently both bands released their album on the same day that year. Whether second or third, No Use put out over 10 releases with Fat, and I had a homemade mixtape with Leche on one side and Behind Bars by 88 Fingers Louie on the other side, with most of Punk and Drum Book filling in the blank spaces. It was a personal fave, and always a good day when that tape came up in my rotation. Snuff from Hendon UK A Suburb of London, excellent, claimed the track 3 spot with the song Nick Northern. Snuff has been a band since 1986, but took a few years hiatus in the early 90s. A few members started another band during that time called Guns and Wankers, and released an album on Fat in 1994. Demi Mamuza Bebonk was Snuff's first Fat release and another personal fave of mine. Nick Northern was a cool song, but I think I liked Squirrels and Martin better. Although between the accent and singing style, I don't think I understood a single word Duncan sang. I actually got to open for Duncan when I was on tour with James Hall in 2014. Duncan is super into ping pong, and there was a table set up in the middle of the dance floor the whole show. The heroes of my hometown, Propagandhi, held down track 4 with Nation States off the Less Talk More Rock album. As mentioned, Prop was tied for the title of second band signed to the label. However, I get the impression they didn't really get along that great with Mike over the years. And the last few records Prop released are on Epitaph. Chris and George from Propagandhi had their own label for a while called G7 Welcoming Committee, which put out a ton of rad stuff and gave a bunch of bands that had something to say a taller platform to spread their message. Prop is still active and are some of the nicest dudes I've met. They've always been super kind to me, and I got to open for them in 2018 in Lindau, Germany. Song 5 on Survival was Sleep by Lagwagon off the Hoss album. Not counting a few Nofx 7 inches, Lagwagon was the first Fat release ever with the Da album, October 1st, 1992. They're one of my all-time fave bands, although about 50 or 60 bands currently hold the title of Greg's all-time favorite, so maybe it's not that prestigious of a title. Sleep was kind of a weird pick, I think personally, and wasn't very representative of the Hoss album, which had so many bangers and better songs. I mean, I liked the song, but if it was my first impression of Lagwagon, I probably wouldn't have bought the album. I feel I really related to the lyrics in Sleep more after I toured in Europe with High Five Drive in 2007, especially the bread and cheese and dirty socks parts. Song 6 was Titty Twister by Diesel Boy, which I feel was the anthem at that point and time of punk rock. Well, what us wannabes wanted to be, at least. Diesel Boy at the West End Cultural Center was the 4th punk show I ever went to in 98 to 99-ish. That was also the first time I saw the band Choke from Edmonton, who made a more lasting impression than Diesel Boy. I kind of remember seeing Diesel Boy again at the Royal Albert a few years after that, and they weren't very good, nor did they seem that thrilled to be there in general. Their first record, Cock Rock, which Titty Twister was on, was super solid, but I was never able to get into anything else they put out past that album. Track 7 was Mother Superior by Good Riddance from the God and Country album. I wasn't a huge fan of this song until I finally read the lyrics. Russ definitely had a lot to say and said it well. The follow-up album to God and Country was called A Comprehensive Guide to Modern Rebellion and was one of my all-time fave albums. Tilt held the track 8 spot with Libel off the Till It Kills album. Tilt was the only female-fronted band on the comp and probably also on the label now that I think about it. I'm not sure why punk was such a sausage party back then. I guess there was still kind of a tough guy attitude that wasn't very inviting to anyone aside from, well, guys. It's a relief to see more female and gender fluid friends these days getting involved. I will confess I've never heard Tilt's album Till It Kills, but I did buy the album Viewers Like You, Tilt's 1999 release, and it was awesome. I even bought a Tilt shirt at Old Calcutta in Winnipeg, which was way too big on me, even for the 90s, but I rocked that shit nonetheless. At track 9, we are past the halfway mark with the only non-English song by German punk rockers Wizzo, Raum der Zeit, which Google translated to Space of Time. The song was off the album entitled Ah, which Google translated to Ah. I remember a friend who understood German said the song isn't really about anything, and most of the lyrics are just the singer contradicting himself. Rotten Apples was track 10 by Strung Out, which was the first punk show I ever went to at the Royal Albert Arms in 1998. The guitar tone on this album I always thought was so cool. It sounded so different from all the other bands and albums at the time. I did monitors for Strung Out at the Pyramid years ago and asked Jake Kelly about it. He said they ran all the guitar tracks through an amp simulator to get the sound, but they actually hated the guitar tone from that album, and it was the producer's idea. Vincent, originally by Don McLean, was Nofx's contribution to Survival at song 11. To be a punk band in the mid to late 90s seemed to come with a mandatory requirement to cover an older song, but in a punk style at some point. Come to think of it, that describes 3 of the 17, or 18% of the tracks on this comp. Perhaps it was a stab at appealing to a broader audience? Maybe it was just easier to rearrange a song that was already written than to write something from scratch. And you know, punks be lazy. Track 12 was Run by Australian punk band Frenzalrom. I gotta confess, I usually skipped this song. I did see Frenzalrom live with Nofx at Le Rendezvous in 2000-2001-ish, and thought they were good, but never gave any of their albums a chance for some reason. A friend pointed out one of the singers in Frenzalrom and myself have almost the exact same voice and singing style, especially in their song Shelving Stacks.
Drew the lines, built the fence, would we be free? Shelving stacks as I'm stacking shelves, try to neutralize.
At this point, a few bands got a second track on the record. Track 13 was Waiting for the Sun by High Standard, which I thought was way better than the California Dreaming cover, which kicked off the record, but it's not my label. Layman's Terms by Lagwagon was song 14 and was an exclusive release to Survival, although I think it appeared on a Lagwagon B-sides and greatest hits album called Let's Talk About Leftovers that came out years later. If I had to pick a fave on the album, it would probably be this one. I remember driving in a friend's car in the summer of '96 with this song cranked on the stereo and really feeling alive at that moment. Like there was so much ahead to be excited about. And for whatever reason, this song was the soundtrack to that thought. Track 15 was Bracket's contribution to the comp with the song Talk Show. Bracket is from Forestville, California, and is still releasing records, including a 2019 album, Too Old to Die Young. Bracket is a bit of an enigma, never super popular, but popular enough to keep going, I guess. I mean, I'd never heard anyone say, "Did you hear the new Bracket album?" But I always thought their songs were cool on the Fat comps. Always well recorded also. Apparently they have toured quite extensively, but I don't think they ever made it to Winnipeg. Track 16 was the second song by Snuff, called Walk. Maybe just to show off that Duncan can drum super fast. Or was it to prove that they are actually a tough, serious punk band for any opinionated punks that were turned off by the organ and horns in Nick Northern? Finally, track 17 is a cover of John Denver's classic Country Roads by Me First and the Gimme Gimmes. This is kind of Me First's thing, to do punk versions of old songs, and they do it well, so I guess they get the pass. There are a ton of factors why Fat Records did so well in the 90s. Mike and Aaron worked their asses off, signed good bands, got them on good tours. From what I've read online and in interviews, they've always treated bands well and never screwed anyone over. The Fat comps came out yearly, and it was always an exciting time to see who made it on the comp and who was going to be the first song, year after year. It was something that put Fat above the rest of the punk labels. It wasn't long till Epitaph, Fearless Records, Hopeless Records, etc. started putting out yearly comps to showcase their bands as well. But they were never as popular as the Fat comps. I'm sure Fat weren't the first label to put out a comp to advertise their bands or anything like that, but I think Fat did it best. In the 90s, at least. If you haven't listened to Survival of the Fattest in a while, give it a spin. Check out fatrec.com and consider a mail order, or go hang out at their record store at the Fat Warehouse if you are in the Bay Area. I've been several times, and I even got to meet Mike and Aaron once. I gave them a CD, of course. They have yet to sign it.